Hello, how are you doing? I hope you had a good reading month over the course of October. If you read anything really good, let me know in the comments below. I hope you had a very happy Halloween. Yesterday, on the 31st, I just stayed in all day watching scary movies and eating a lot of junk food and chocolate. And I also carved a pumpkin, so here's my scary guy. And I have the battle scars to prove it, because I cut myself while I was carving the pumpkin. I'm not very good with a knife, but, I was quite annoyed that I cut myself. So I'm looking forward to making this guy into a soup. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about the books I read over the course of October. I read some really good ones. I did lots and lots of reading, actually. So first off, I'm going to start talking about The Housing Lark by Sam Selvon. So this is a novel. This is a reprinted novel of a classic novel that was first published in the 60s, and it's set in the 60s about a group of men of Caribbean descent living in the Brixton area of London during that time, and how one of them decides that because he is sick of paying lots of rent and for really bad accommodation, and he dreams of owning his own home, and so in order, he knows that by himself he won't be able to save up to do that, so he decides to band together with a group of other of his friends to try to pool their money together, and then they can buy a house together, or at least that's the plan. And but some of them aren't as good at saving as other ones. Some of them aren't as serious as the other ones. So it comes into points of conflict there. And so yeah, it's about a number of these different men's stories, and some women's stories. Although it's it mainly focuses on the men, and I was a bit worried at first because there's quite a lot of misogynistic opinions that they express over the course of it, but over the novel, I felt like the author was really sort of undermining those ideas, because it sort of, there's one man in particular that was quite derogatory about women, but then you saw in his actual relationship, he was the one that was made to be submissive and sort of follow the rules, and then there are some other strong female characters that come up over the course of the novel that really bring them together and start moving this plan forward in a way that it feels like they can't do themselves. And it just follows a number of their stories, and it's just really interesting to see a depiction of London at that time, a depiction of a community that wasn't often portrayed in literature by writers at that time. And so I thought it was really interesting, but also a lot of this novel is very comic in the way, in its sort of tone, and there's this hilarious trip that they organized to go to Hampton Court in order to raise money for this project, which all sort of kind of goes wrong, or it's very chaotic anyway, but in a very hilarious way. But then there will be a moment where it just gets very serious, where there'll be an instance of racism, and you'll sort of realize, that there are serious issues attached to this as well. So yeah, I thought this was a really fascinating novel. It's quite short, quite a powerful read. I've not read anything by Sam Selvon before, so I want to read more of his books now. I also read Edmund White's new novel, A Saint from Texas, and this novel was so much fun to read. It was really such a joy. It's about identical twin sisters growing up in Texas in the 1950s. They're called Yvonne and Yvette, or some people in that area pronounce it Yvonne and Yvette. And even though they're identical, they couldn't be more opposite from each other. One is, very saintly, very studious, very inclined towards religion, and the other one is more inclined to partying and high society and fashion and clothes. So one of them moves to Colombia to do charitable work, and the other one moves to Paris, where she ascends to the heights of Parisian society. She marries a baron, and has all the sort of pitfalls that sort of go along with that high society life. And that's a sort of lifestyle that Edmund White has written about a lot before, very perceptively and beautifully and insightfully, and he does so again in this novel. But it's really interesting seeing how he gives the opposite take as well of a woman who is very pious and very religiously inclined, and there's a lot in it about about sort of like scripture and her interpretation and response to scripture, and why she's so inclined towards religion. And it's really fascinating how he looks at these opposite points of view as a way of almost creating like how showing how personality is so like complex and can go in so many different ways dependent on experience and sort of following different ideas to a certain end. And so I thought that was so clever how he did that. But just the story itself is so entertaining that it just draws you along. And yeah, I just thought this is so much fun to read. I love his writing and really highly recommend this novel. And I was glad I talked about this recently as one of the 10 best books of the year according to Publishers Weekly, and I'm so glad they selected it for that. I also finally got around to reading one of the most hyped novels of the year, or at least over here in Britain. This novel has been much talked about. I don't know if it's made a splash in the rest of the world yet, but that's Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan. And this is a novel about a young Irish woman who moves to Hong Kong to teach English as a second language, and it's about how she meets a man named Julian, who's a banker there, and she sort of has this relationship with him, which they don't label as a relationship, even though they have sex and they move in together. And she also meets a woman named Edith, who she feels very drawn towards. And so it's about the tricky triangle of a relationship between them and all the complications that go along with it. But it's more about like her identity and trying to figure out what she wants to do in her life. She feels very estranged from her Irish culture that she grew up in certain ways. Like she'll talk with her mother, who is happy that her brothers have become bankers and have gone into that sort of profession, and that's not really what she wants to pursue. But because Julian is English, it also gives a very funny perspective on the English from an Irish perspective as well. And because she's teaching English, there's a lot in it about language and sort of inherited notions to do with the class system, and how English is spoken is really, indicative of where you come from and where you sort of fit into in society. Julian's friends make a lot of cutting remarks about her. And so I think it's really clever how it does that. But also, yeah, just as a sort of exploration of young adulthood, like I've had a lot of people ask me for recommendations of books that are like Normal People by Sally Rooney, and I feel like this novel is really a natural recommendation to go alongside that book, because they do explore some similar themes about class and relationships. It's sort of all about a relationship at the center of this, but then again, like I said, it's not really about the relationship. It's more about her own identity and finding her way in life in this sort of stumbling way. She makes a lot of mistakes, and it's very funny and sort of wry commentary on modern young adulthood, and I just absolutely enjoyed it. Also, continuing along with my Booker Prize reading, I finally got to reading The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste. A lot of people have been discussing this novel. You probably already know that it's about Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia during World War II, or directly before World War II, and how a number of Ethiopians sort of rose up to defend their country, and how it particularly focuses on the perspective of a group of women who fought alongside the men during a whole series of battles. And this novel recounts many of those battles. So like a lot of people have been discussing as well, there's a lot of historical detail in this. So I actually felt quite similar to reading this as I did when I first was trying to get into Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, in that it's this historical period that I wasn't that familiar with. And so I found I had to really concentrate in a number of different scenes to follow the action of what was going on in accordance with the sort of world events that were happening, and I had to look some things up occasionally. But I felt like the writing was really worth it, and she draws you into the story in a really clever way, in that there's a orphaned a young woman who goes to live with a couple, one of them who is an officer for the emperor, and also his wife, and how there's a very tense relationship there between the three of them. But then how that is completely upended when the invasion takes place and the battles start happening, and all of these relationships are reconfigured because of the war, and you know how it just completely changes everyone's life in ways that they didn't expect. And so some people that you were initially sympathetic with, you become more critical of, and then there are other characters that you're probably more critical of at first, and then you become more sympathetic with them. And it's really interesting how she shows those different personalities. And what I found most moving about this novel, I think, was how personalities are so changed by a war in ways that people can expect, but also how different people use different strategies in order to survive such a traumatic period. You know, some people sort of go into anonymity. There's a character called the cook, and we never know her real name because she doesn't want to divulge it. She's lived through a number of different conflicts, and she's been able to do that by keeping this sort of private to herself and then strategizing how she's going to get through it. And then there are other characters that become so like confident and become, you know, real leaders to you know, a revolution almost. And there's also a European character of Jewish descent who talks about his family background and how he's had to survive the war. And, you know, obviously since it's going into World War II, it's very like tense, worrying what's going to happen to him and to his family. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting and complex how she portrays all of that. And I found all that very moving. But then there are also parts of this book that are so dense and I found really difficult to get into and really follow the story. So I found it quite challenging in some ways and sort of difficult to read, you know, and like I said with the like I did with reading Hilary Mantel's book. And so there were certain scenes I almost just sort of had to sort of skim over. Like, I don't completely know everything that's going on here, but I'm just going to sort of go along with the story and hope it all comes together. You know, I had the sort of same experience reading Wolf Hall, and so I think this is a novel that if I went back and reread it, I would probably get so much more out of it because I would already know the story and I could follow the nuances of the characters and the action a lot more. But yeah, so for a first reading, you know, I thought it was slightly difficult to get through, and it's a novel that I feel like I more appreciated than enjoyed, you know, especially and there are certainly some really beautifully written scenes, some moving characters, but you know, on the whole I found it a bit of a slog to get through. I also finally got to a classic novel I've been wanting to read for so long and that I've been talking about for so long. I made a video at the start of this year about classic novels I want to read this year, and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is one of those novels, and I finally read it just before the new film of Rebecca came out. And I'm not going to say much about that because there's really not much good to say about that new adaptation. I only watched about half of it. I thought it was very clunky, some of the choices that they made, and also the main characters didn't seem really right for the roles. And yeah, it was just very weird. I mean, Armie Hammer looked amazing in his suit, even though that didn't seem like a suit that character would wear. But anyway, so yeah, I'm talking about the movie and I said I wasn't going to. But yeah, I loved reading this novel. I just sort of fell into the story. It was so atmospheric and tense, and, you know, as this sort of character study of, you know, the main character, the narrator, whose name we never know, but who becomes the new Mrs. De Winter in the novel. We're initially very sympathetic with her, or at least I was initially very sympathetic with her as a very shy individual coming from, you know, this sort of working class background, or at least she starts as this sort of lady companion for an awful society woman, and then to go into this stately home and have all these servants and to feel very shy and timid around all of them. But then over the course of the novel, I found my sympathy with her sort of waning a bit, and also I became, you know, sort of knowledgeable that she was really had all this fear about Rebecca and the first Mrs. De Winter because of her own insecurities, and how, you know, this is really just her own projections. All of this, a lot of this sort of spooky stuff about the presence of this woman in this household is really her own projections. Even though, you know, there are obviously Mrs. Danvers, who's one of the most fantastic characters in all of literature, I think. I mean, she's such a villainous character in a way, but, you know, also slightly sympathetic in how it I think there's little question that she had a like romantic interest in Rebecca, because, you know, there's a scene where she takes the narrator into Rebecca's bedroom and is starting to show her underwear and stuff, and, you know, it's like very intimate stuff. So yeah, I thought that was really clever how she sort of wove that into the story, and how Mrs. Danvers is such a fascinating character and so awful in some ways, but then also so fabulous in other ways. I mean, I really enjoyed reading about her. It's natural that the narrator would be scared of Mrs. Danvers, but yeah, I think a lot of her ideas about Rebecca are her own projections, and I thought it's so fascinating how the author built up all these many different perspectives of who Rebecca was. You know, you get thoughts of who she was through Mrs. Danvers and through Mr. De Winter, and also through another character that is very dodgy, Rebecca's cousin, who sort of enters into it, and yeah, and you get very different ideas about her through this, and you realize that you're never really going to know who Rebecca was. You just get her an idea of her through all these different perspectives. And I thought that was so fascinating, really surprising, something that I wasn't really expecting from the novel. I just sort of thought it would be more of like a haunted ghost type story, which it is in a way, but then, you know, in another way, it's really fascinating. And so yeah, I can see why this is a classic you would want to go back to again and again, because you'd probably have different interpretations from it. Now, saying all that and saying that I really enjoyed it, I didn't think it was entirely perfect. I thought the latter part of the novel sort of went downhill for me, in that it's basically following the sort of mystery of what really happened to Rebecca through a lot of like tedious like interviews with a variety of people, and how the latter part of the novel is really like a device to sort of get some of the main characters away from the stately home in order for something to happen there. And it just sort of felt like it was sort of too controlling on the author's part, and I just so I just didn't really enjoy the latter part of it so much. But on the whole, I thought it was amazing novel, and I'm glad that I finally got to reading it. I also did a double bill of reading two books by the author Ellie Williams, and I made a video a number of months ago where I talked about a group of authors that I've never read before, but that I think I would love if I ever got to reading their books, just because they seem like the kind of authors that I would love to read. So I thought I would dive in and read both of Ellie Williams' books that she's published. She's published a book of short stories called Attrib, which I have read some of these short stories in the past, but I went back and read all of the stories in this collection. And then her debut novel, which is called The Liar's Dictionary, which came out earlier this year. Now, Attrib is, it was published, I think 3 or 4 years ago. It won a book award for short story collections, and also won the Republic of Consciousness Prize. And the stories are so playful and funny, and a lot about language, and sort of the playfulness of language and the meaning of words, and that sounds very like dry, but just the way she presents it is so funny and insightful and very witty, and but also like a lot of these stories will sort of draw you into the lives of their characters. She uses the second person a lot in a number of these stories, and there is this sort of like romance behind a number of these stories. Like one story is about a last meeting between lovers at a train station, and a photo that is taken, and in a time long in the future, the character is looking at this photo and realizing that in the photo a man's toupee in the background has like flown off his head and is mid-air, and the photo catches the toupee as it's flying behind him and is about to hit the face of the man behind him. So it's quite funny in that way. But then as she's like going on about all of these details, and she goes into a lot of detail about a number of like seemingly trivial things. There is this sort of emotion in the background that you can feel is being suppressed and not being consciously dealt with. And I think in a way that makes the stories more emotional than, if they were these kind of confessional narratives where she was saying what she really felt. So I thought that was a really fascinating way to approach it. And also there's a number of stories that look at just like a number of sort of quirky jobs. It's just a sort of funny way of looking at a number of different professions. Like there's one character that's trying to record sounds that will go into an audio guide for an art exhibit. And then there's like another story about a cook whose specialty is cooking birds and alcohol. And so, yeah, there's sort of like quirky professions that she focuses on, and a lot of the sort of details that come up through that. So yeah, you learn a lot of like interesting odd facts. I have to say that not all of the short stories worked for me. There were some that I felt like they were a bit too abstract to really sort of get into or feel like I really understood the characters or what was happening in that situation, and felt like it was more about the ideas of the story rather than the actual characters themselves. But on the whole, I really enjoyed this collection. I thought it was so fascinating and really gave me strong vibes of Ali Smith. She's a writer that is also very playful with language and also the way she portrays her characters. And so, but like with Ali Smith, I think it'll be sort of, her writing is sort of hit and miss. You'll probably really enjoy it, or it might really not be your thing. So yeah, it was fascinating to go on then and read her novel, The Liar's Dictionary, which is about two characters on either end of the century that are researching words for a dictionary. This particular dictionary in London that has been going for a long time and has a great tradition, and how the character in the current time, Mallory, whose sections are narrated in the first person, you can see that this sort of publication is deteriorated over time, and there's less staff there, and the actual building that they work in is sort of crumbling and falling down, and there are like rats running around, but then in the character in the past, who's in the year 1899, his sections are narrated in the third person, and you get this much grander idea of this publication that he's working on. And yeah, it's fascinating how it has that same thing of really focusing on language, and obviously because they're researching for a dictionary, they focus a lot on different words and the meaning behind them, or the ambiguities of these words' meaning and how their meaning is changed over time. And but then also about these characters' lives who are very introverted. I mean, I feel like a lot of her characters in her stories really exude this very introverted sensibility of people who, sit by themselves and do a lot of thinking and find it quite difficult to relate to other people. There's very awkward scenes in from the character in the past when he goes to a party and doesn't really know how to speak to people, and then he meets a woman there that he becomes romantically infatuated with. And then it's interesting how Mallory, the character in the present day, she has a female lover who she has a very strong relationship with, but how Mallory feels slightly uncomfortable about introducing her as her girlfriend and isn't very comfortable with being out in that sort of way. And I thought it's really interesting and honest how she portrays that experience, because that's the experience of a lot of gay people who find it quite difficult to be open in that way, or at least in the way that some other gay people do. And that's an interesting theme, having read this directly after the book of short stories, because one of the short stories has to do with a character who's in a gallery and she wants to kiss her girlfriend there, but feels very nervous about doing so, and is sort of stressing all about whether she should or not over the course of the story. And then at the end of the story, her girlfriend just kisses her as if it didn't even bear thinking about. And so yeah, it's sort of interesting how she explores that theme. But then there's even though it sounds like because it's so much about language that there wouldn't be a lot of action in this, but there is sort of surprising amount in it. Like there's this whole fight scene with a pelican in a park, and which is quite funny. And then there's like a very dramatic scene on a train that takes place. And so yeah, she does build some action into this. And also Mallory, there she's receiving these phone calls of a man who's threatening her, or actually their voice is disguised. She doesn't know if it's a man or a woman, and there's this whole mystery but behind who is this person that's calling her and why would they be doing it. And so yeah, there's these interesting mysteries running throughout the novel, as well as this real attention to detail that she has in her stories of sort of exploring language and how language really expresses who we are as people. And so I think it's an interesting way of looking at identity in that way. And yeah, I think she's an absolutely fascinating writer. So I'm glad that I finally dove into her work. And also finally, since it was Victober, and I haven't done as well with my Victober TBR as I was hoping to, I've read about half of Charles Dickens' The Old Curiosity Shop, and I've been listening to it on audiobook sort of off and on over the course of the month. And I always find with Dickens, like it takes me a little while to get back into his style of writing, because the way he writes about characters, they're so exaggerated and extreme. Like I think especially in this novel, the good characters are very good. They're almost like saintly, and then the bad characters are very, very bad and are described in these sort of despicable terms, again and again. And I find that a bit overbearing to begin with, but then I get back into his sort of style of writing in just creating these situations, these sort of dramatic situations, and these sort of subtle social commentary that he makes, that I find it very enjoyable. And especially this novel, as it begins with walking through London, and I've been doing a lot of walking around London recently. It's been quite enjoyable listening to this on audiobook while I'm walking around the city, and thinking about how Dickens was a great walker as well, and how he would walk through the city at night and like get his ideas for his stories and his characters. And I just enjoy how sort of the characters will be like stopping along the way, like the little Nell and her grandfather set out on the road after they become completely impoverished, and are trying and meet a whole range of like very odd characters along the way. And I just enjoy how so they'll sort of stop it with this troupe of Punch and Judy players, and then they'll pass another character who's cooking up a pot full of tripe, and you get all these wonderful little details about the period and the time and the people, and so I just really enjoy that aspect of it. But the overall story as a whole, I'm not all that invested in. It's just more the details of the story that I'm really enjoying, I think, more so than some of his other novels, where the overall story, like A Tale of Two Cities or Great Expectations, I could really get into the meat and the conflict of those overall stories. But this, I'm just sort of more enjoying the characters and the situation and the details, I think. So I'm going to continue on with listening this and finish reading The Old Curiosity Shop just over the course of the winter, I think, and continue to enjoy Victober over that time. So yeah, let me know what you think of Charles Dickens, if you have any favorite novels of his, or if you don't really get along with his writing all that much. But if you've read any of these novels, I'd love to know your opinion about them and your thoughts about them, or if you're interested in reading any of them, let me know. And just let me know what else you've read over the course of October that you've really enjoyed. I'd like to hear about that in the comments below. But hope you're doing well during these trying times. We've just gone back into lockdown in England, where everything is going to shut down again soon. And it's very, very sad, but it's going to afford a lot more reading time. So I hope you're doing well and staying safe, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye.